Welcome very much, Götz Aly. Nice that you have joined us. Very nice. Good evening. Professor Aly, as a historian, as a political scientist, actually, if I may say so, you are the expert on the history of National Socialism, economic policy in the SS era, the Holocaust, the anti-Semitism. But tonight we are talking about something totally different. The Bismarck Archipelago, the Hermit Islands, the Louvre Island, all are located in the Western Pacific. And for the new book that has just been published, the Prachtboot, how the Germans looted the art treasures in the South Sea. Well, how is it that you have such a radical change in themes? Well, it's not a change in theme, it's a coincidental book, so to speak, and I'm so happy about it. It's a deflection also. It's easier to work on a book than on the issue like the Germans occupied Poland or Soviet Union. And also in terms of sources, it's much simpler. I had a great uncle who was a pastor of the military marine. He went there when the flags were hoisted in Africa and in the South Sea in the colony German New Guinea, and he was always on the first ship to go there and gave the Protestant blessings. And I found this in my family archive, which I run. And I thought I write a little text for a paper for a weekend magazine of the Aly Island. This also exists there, and German colonialism. Once the Humboldt Forum was to be opened, but it didn't open. So the text became thicker and thicker and became a book. And the Humboldt Forum is still not opened, although the text was finished already in April last year. So that means the ship that we are talking about, this large, magnificent boat, the last of its type, was not focused on. Only during your research work you found it. Yes, indeed. And that was coincidence as well. I knew that boat, and with our kids, that's 45 years ago, I always went to the Ethnological Museum Berlin-Dahlem when there was rain. We lived close by, I still live there. And I was looking at it in a naive way, as most other people at that time as well. And one motive to put the ship into the center was that the director of the Humboldt Forum in a background discussion told journalists it's a Lugdagolo. They will be careful. They won't show objects that have a bad past, and we have so many of the kind, so we can really select those that don't have this very bad past. And I knew already that the boat was already in the Humboldt Forum. It was so large that they had to leave one wall open to get it in. It was in an aircom box coming in, and then I said, okay, I take this boat, they can't take it out any longer. What's specific about the Prachtboot, and what did you find out? I would like to show the picture of it if possible. It's really a piece of world cultural heritage. It's the only boat of its type that still exists. It's a double-mast outrigger from South Sea. It's one log that was used, and there are planks and boards that are insulated with a mast, and the boards are sewn. There has been no nail or any iron piece used, and it could carry the weight of about 50 people, and you could really sail against the wind thousands of kilometers over the South Sea. So this big travel boat of the Louvre Island is the only boat of its kind. Probably there were 100 or thousands, but this is the only one left. And this gives us an idea how 5, 6, 7,000 years ago, the South Sea was traveled, when in Germania, people lived in caves or holes in the ground, a high culture, civilized culture, very great. And this boat, this last piece, and the German colonial masters in their punitive expeditions and murdering raids against the natives there always burned these boats in order to damage people there. And that's the only one that is left in the world. And this is now located in Berlin. This is the boat, and the sails are down shortly before it was transported to Berlin. It's the farewell picture, so to speak, and the Herrnsheim dealer brings it to Berlin, and then it's sold to the Ethnological Museum in Berlin. That there are wonderful paintings and carvings on that boat. You should imagine these people who lived in the South Sea Islands that was subsistence farming. And they had a lot of time. They had abundant fish and coconuts and breadfruit trees and all different things to eat. So they needn't fight for their survival every day. And for that reason, maybe these islands were settled later on. And as long as colonial masters were not there, this life functioned well. Only when colonialism arrived there, these islands were to be economized and turned into coconut plantations. And people should work there for 10, 12 hours a day for a European market. That was the commodity that it was all about, the coconut trees. Yeah, that was an essential commodity. The copra that was peeled off the nuts and dried and brought to Germany, and they produced margarine and soap with it. And it was really worth it to deal with that. And people, young men, young women were brought from one island to another, and they were collected. They called it labor trade, and only few came back. And they had to work there on the plantations, and at the same time the culture of the indigenous people was destroyed. Mr. Ali, you found out that the boat was not originally meant to go to Berlin. Probably it could have gone somewhere else. Yes. Basically, this boat was meant for Cologne, because here it was offered to the Rautenstrauch-Joest Museum in Cologne, and that was back in 1902. And for that purpose, the pictures were made that you have seen. That was, so to speak, the catalogue with which the Herrnsheim company wanted to sell that boat. And there is an interesting coincidence today. When writing this book, I heard that it was offered here, and I wrote a letter to the City Archive Cologne, and I also got the number of the file. And then I learned that when there was this accident and with the underground station where it's everything slipped down, and I heard that this was slipped, this file was also slipped and became wet, and then they said they would restore the file. And 3/4 of a year later, today at 2:04 p.m., I was sent the file, and here you can read the dealer Herrnsheim, the merchant, said the following, and probably you can see that here on that picture. Here he talks to the museum, the then director Foy, and writes, "Would a 50-feet boat, fully carved and painted, a magnificent boat from the Hermit Island. It's unique of its kind, and it's a witness of a completely disappeared artful work of islanders who have become extinct. Would you be interested in buying the boat? The price would be 6,000 mark. That was a lot of money. It was gold mark. And here it says everything: the extinction, the extermination of the people. And originally it was more than 400 people who lived on the Louvre Island. At that time, when the boat was offered, it were 50 to 60 people who were still alive there, and the whole atoll had just been sold off to another Hamburg merchant, a certain Mr. Wahlen, who turned that into a coconut plantation. And in the course of that sale, the boat was taken away, and Herrnsheim writes, "It went over into my possession." So this is not buying it, but it just changed possession or ownership. This is how he got it. And the extinction had several reasons. First, there was the horrible punitive expedition. There were two German warships that arrived at Christmas time, 1882-83. At that time, after a presumable murder that was never ever described, two ships really shot at the island for 12 days or more, and Marines just entered the islands and completely destroyed it. A 6 square meter island, completely destroyed. 350 Marine warriors fighting against men, adult men, maybe 80, 100, and on the other side, you only had spares. And after that, life had been reduced strongly. We never ever learned properly how many people died. People assumed that at least half of the people died, and those who survived, mainly male persons, were deported to other islands, and from other islands other workers came to Louvre. And then the second source comes, the bringing in of infections by Europeans. Felix von Nuschan, the director of the South Sea Collection in Berlin, said civilization is syphilization, that is bringing in syphilis or other diseases. Women were always infected. They were regarded freely available, being available for them as they wished. And of course, other diseases were brought in, influenza, flu, but also tuberculosis, even malaria was brought in at that time. All these diseases didn't exist on these islands, and people didn't have any resistance against these diseases. And it was astonishing to hear the official story that was told, and partly it's still told today. It was a totally different one, why this people doesn't exist any longer. Yeah, that's absolutely insane. It's absolutely insane that till short time ago, the official story of the Ethnological Museum Berlin-Dahlem told it that way. They always said that people voluntarily decided to become extinct, to die out. And this is proven by a lecture of Otto van Wolf, who was a ship physician, a medical doctor that was the expert in tropical medicine and ethnology and languages. And he was on Louvre in 1902, and on a neighboring island, he visited an Irish merchant who liked gin a lot. On these pictures, I think this Irish merchant is shown. He was called Jimmy, and Jimmy Devlin. And he told him that they wanted to become extinct, and therefore they didn't produce any children or aborted them. And also, after the destruction by the Germans, four large boats were built in order to raid a neighboring island, but it became capsized, and therefore all men drowned, and also the boats disappeared. But all that was invented by Jimmy Devlin. In 1908, he told it the ethnologist Paul Hambrook very proudly. And he told him how he cheated and didn't tell the truth. But still, for 120 years, that story was told in Berlin. Last year, journalists that learned about the magazine of the Ethnological Museum about it, but it's not true. It's an invention. It's an invented story that is to legitimize now that it was not German violence that really made the extinction of that people, this high civilized culture, but that it was their own decision and unhappy circumstances, and that it was legitimate. That's what the story told, that this boat now is in Berlin. And in Berlin, people even say, you can't give it back. because on that island no one is living any longer of those who built the boat at that time. But at that time, in colonial times, people knew exactly what was happening, that there was German violence. You quoted Max Thiel, the main representative of a Hamburg merchant house. They also earned a lot of money with the Prachtboot. Do you think that I can give ethical lectures to my captains or seamen before I sent them on the trip? Do you think that was unethical? No, they didn't think so. The problem is that it was not understood as being unethical, but it was regarded self-understood. It was criticized, but the so-called punitive expeditions or castigations, I mean, that happened 100 times on these islands. And that was reported in papers. It was mentioned in the German Marine magazine. And also it was self-understood that warships were delivering to ethnological museums. You know, for warships, there were decrees and orders that were issued, how they can collect objects and who paid for that. All this was organized. And if you now look into the published files of the Foundation of Prussian Heritage, and if you look at individual objects, all of a sudden you can see collection hyena. That's true, but it would be nice to say gunboat hyena, and then you would know a bit more. Or you read there expedition SMS Corolla. And if you wrote in addition punitive expedition, cruise corvette Corolla, then you knew a bit more about the truth, the real truth. And if you looked into the Freiburg military archive, you could describe precisely how the punitive expedition happened. Do you think that's just concealing the facts? No, it's an institutional inner self image that has become a tradition over decades. It has nothing to do with the Weimar Republic or National Socialism or the Empire or Federal Republic of Germany. No, they stopped thinking about it in these institutions. They rather concentrated on the objects, on the collection, renovating them, restoring them, exhibiting them, and every 30 years they tried to modernize them. And the discipline of ethnology is also the result of colonialism somehow. You cannot deny that. But this, is not meant against modern ethnologists or museums. No, I'm not talking against those people, but I'm rather in favor of looking at the real history and adding the facts here, talk about the facts, and that you make it clear in the museums that the observer not only sees the beautiful objects, which were curiosity or exotic specialities before and presented that way, not only that, but also explaining the background, like saying this was becoming prey in that and that way. And within 20 years, in a very short period of time, without people exerting positive influence on the change, the living conditions have turned around totally. There was this flourishing, small, highly civilized culture. And all of a sudden, it became just a cold coconut plantation with productive demands for the world market competition. And also they turned free people into forced laborers, animals. You mentioned museums as an institution so often that we should talk about that. But before that, the hint, in the 50 minutes the two of us will talk to each other, we can't really talk about the whole width of what is depicted in the book. And therefore, my hint, on your website, there is a question and answer function. And here you can raise your questions to Götz Aly, and we will answer them in the stream, or try at least to answer them. We are in an ethnological museum, Mr. Aly. And in the context of colonial violence, we not only restrict our activities to Africa, and this is shown by our exhibition Resist, its resistance documented all around the globe against colonial efforts. But this museum has also 83 objects from today's Papua New Guinea in the most populous federal state of Germany, Northern Westphalia. It has the only Oceania collections. What was the role of the museums at that time? Or asked the other way around, why do we have these collections in German museums today? Well, first, in Germany, we have a lot of ethnological museums, which is unusual. In Berlin, in Leipzig, in Hamburg, in Bremen, in Cologne, in Stuttgart, and at many other places, we have really very large collections in a very decentralized way. And the reason is this collection, this presentation of curiosities of former colonial countries or colonized countries, and most comes from German colonies, and most came to Germany before 1914 in that very short but very fierce and violent German colonial time. So 80 to 95% of all these objects came in that way. And it was also meant to legitimate German colonialism and the interest in it, to say these are strange primitive people. They have this simple art with a lot of colors, and they carve very strange things, not even having very sharp knives, but they can still do it. It was very much paternalizing and arrogant. And the natural primitive people and their ethnology was different from the cultivated people like East Asia. These were people and cultures that could write, and therefore the Chinese and the Japanese are different. And on the other side, the European culture that was brought to a separate museums. And then we had the primitive people in the ethnological museums first, like in Vienna, that was next to the stones and the fish and all these objects there. And ethnologists at that time thought if they research into it and take a closer look, then you would get an idea how our predecessors 30, 50 years ago lived.
Stationary peoples who grow like blades of grass, and there's no cultural activity going on. And those so-called primitive peoples had no history, they had no writing, total disdain, total lack of interest in the people. But in contrast to that, you saw the boats that that could cross the Pacific before the European even knew how to use any such ship. That's what you have to become aware of. And the museum people acted accordingly. They didn't accept people as, people to communicate on eye to eye with. Violence was very common, very frequent. If you look at the Benin bronzes, very clear. Even in the South Sea, violence is current. When German expeditions and collectors came from museums, anthropological or ethnological museums, well, no matter what you call them, they still have this violent background, and people ran away. So the collectors came and picked up the things that were left behind by the people who had run away. And picking up these things, they called that anonymous purchase. And what they left may be some bars of tobacco, very tasteless, terrible tobacco that they left behind. And they even founded smoker schools to make people dependent on this tobacco so that it could use this as a currency. And some museum contains two of these bars. Actually, that was the money that we used in the German South Sea. The people were so primitive that we could pay them with this kind of money. Then you had beads, you had glass beads and other cheap objects later on maybe a little bit more expensive, maybe mirrors, but in general, this is a robbery. This is taking advantage of people, completely dishonest way of doing business. And in most any cases, you can't really prove how these objects came to us. So legal purchase completely excluded, not completely excluded, but I wouldn't exclude that. But the way the colonial situation was at the time, people had no way of influencing the living conditions. Actually, they had no influence on what object was taken. So the burden of proof really has to be reversed. If you can't prove that something was acquired honestly and that you bought this for an equivalent, if you can't prove that, then the concerned object doesn't belong to us. In general, I would say, if you look into you have to think ahead, of course. You should just relinquish any claim to these objects. We have things in our museums from Papua New Guinea that don't exist in Papua New Guinea anymore. Not even at the National Museum and Port Moresby. So, and that applies to Africa as well, and to other areas on the globe as well, Latin America as well. We should maybe look at ourselves as trustees and the people who live in the former colonies who are now independent, should be those who gave the objects to be in our custody, but not to, not to be appropriated by us. This will take so much time. We haven't really started this in connection with objects from the South Sea, but we have to open this option. We have to make sure that we are aware of the fact that we don't own these objects. We have them in our custody. We have to secure them. We have to take care of them. We have to restore them. And we have to do something else. We also have to make available the original inventories that the museums dispose of. We have to publish them completely in a readable manner. I mean, computers can transform these. It might take 5 months just to make these accessible. The Federal Archive does that in regular time intervals. So these lists and inventories have to be available, have to be made available for everybody to read, and then of course they have to be translated into English so that they can be accessible at an international level. And on this basis, we can continue. So we have to talk about these things in Germany to make clear how the colonial circumstances were. We have to communicate with the international community to make people aware of the fact that these objects were just taken out of their context. In the most cases, we don't know what village they were taken from. We don't know what a certain figurine or a certain ornament really means. We have to know how important they were for rituals, for funerals, for example, for other ceremonies for young men and women, rites of passage, for instance. These things will have to be made public. They would have to be, it would take time, of course, several decades probably. Can't do this from, in a matter of days, but this is a process that we have to engage in. We have to develop this, and as the Berlin Humboldt Forum or this Rautenstrauch-Joest Museum is concerned, these are the locations that can really promote this process actively, can open their doors, can make the lists, publish the lists, and that's why I think the ethnologists, the anthropologists are important. I'm a historian. I met many ethnologists, anthropologists who've been to the South Sea. They've spent years there. They know about these objects, and this knowledge has to be made available, to the public, and has to be taken out of the museal context, and the post-colonial connotations have to be maybe taken away in order to make these things available to a general public. And then you ask, and next thing would be to ask which parts would you give back? Would you maybe replicate some pieces? And how to go about these processes also is important to think about these things as well. But there's no point in saying we lock everything away or we'll give everything back tomorrow. This is it's not the way to go about it. We would miss an opportunity really to clarify, to inform people in Germany, which is quite an international public actually, would miss the opportunity to familiarize people with German and European colonial history. The knowledge about these things has to be made publicly available. Discussion has to be intensified. And I think these are things that we're only starting. This would be one aim, really, and this is one of the aims that the book has had. In Cologne, some objects were bought in the 1960s, and there was a publication of that talked about visiting a warship, but somehow people were aware of the fact that things weren't acquired without violence. Felix von Buchan, shortly before he died, in one of his books, he said the ethnological museums a monument to imperial politics, and the Prussian Minister of Cultural said when the museum was inaugurated, right next to the topography of Terra, actually right next to that, he says, without the imperial war machinery, we wouldn't have anything in this museum, really. So officers and accountants and other people, who went to the South Sea, they got equipment and various lists, and also ordered really certain objects to be looted, and also those boats are included on those lists for people to go and pick who benefited, who made a profit when these things, the expedition started. Merchant companies actually had various claims in those areas, and ethnological objects were only like a side source of income, curiosities. They collected these items on the side actually, but they also sometimes gave them to museums for free for several reasons. First, they wanted titles. The title of consul was quite coveted. Also, they wanted to have medals. In those colonies, a lot of people, often you had people working who climbed the social ladder, and so they were awarded medals, some king's medal, and so they could just they also would get certain positions, a Swedish consul, for instance, and also delivered to Oslo, so he became the Norwegian consul. the third thing was, the securing commercial privileges, because they were always highly coveted, and they had privileges when it came to the costs of freight, and those privileges had to be maintained. And so you gave ethnological curiosities to maintain these privileges, actually. Now, your scenario, you explained how we could go about things, talking about transparency, dialogue, but you don't talk about immediate restitution. I would like to quote two sentences that I hear from curators at times. You place our complete collections under a general suspicion, and the other argument would be, isn't it all nice to have it all counted as world cultural heritage, and that these things are at home everywhere in the globe, and in parentheses, they are more secure here than they would be in the Southern Hemisphere. These arguments, I've heard them quite a number of times. Mr. Patzinger, one of the instrumental figures at the Humboldt Forum, he said, we don't give anything back to countries where civil wars are fought. Well, maybe I wouldn't. That's why I say, let's take time. Let's see how situations can stabilize. These nations are young. They have to find their ways. It takes time. We need time. We need partners that will make sure that things will work out properly. But when a German says that I'm not going to give anything back to countries where civil war are raging, Germans have started two big world wars that destroyed treasures and property. It sounds very strange to my ears, really. And if we restitute, or if we understand ourselves as holding these things, and it is up to them to decide what we are supposed to do with these objects. When we look at giving property back to Jews, but you could also offer them on some market, and it's none of our business, actually, if they decide to deal with these objects the way they feel proper. They could also establish museums. It would be up to their decisions, really. And Europeans or Germans aren't the only ones to decide on how to go about these things. These people who have to come to grips with a difficult past, they are the ones who decide what to do with these subjects. On the other question about, putting our collections under general suspicion, up to now, people always said, this is most of these objects were purchased, without force being used. My book contradicts this. People knew what they were doing, and anthropologists, ethnologists said that what's going on is terrible. This is a continued use of force and destruction and plunder and no discipline, and we have to save what can be saved before the cultural house is going to fall apart. If the house is in flames, we have to save everything, or the last remnants, before everything falls prey to violence from Germany or even Europe. So I mean, this illustrates that there was no justified, no legal way of appropriating things, and general suspicion. Well, up to now, people said this suspicion doesn't exist. There are buyers and people who give things away for free. And if you look at things closely, you say collector, Webster. Webster is an auctioneer in London. actually they sold things off on the international market. You know, violent British soldiers had appropriated these things and they sold them and made money. This is not a collector, Webster. It's a lie if you list them in the inventory like this in published online presentations. It's not about collection. It was about violent appropriation. What impressed me about your book, Mr. Aly, you write in a quite understandable manner, very deep. You did research, you transcribed documents, you translated documents, you present quite a number of drawings and pictures, quite an expert presentation. Why did these Humboldt Forum and the pandemics really, why did it take them for you to start working on this subject? Why didn't this subject come to people's attention maybe decades ago? You know, there is literature which criticizes colonial goings on. You have the anthropological department of the University of Tübingen in 1984 published a very critical collection of essays, but they did not find their way into the wider public. Actually, 40 years ago, I must say that I didn't really think about where this item, like the magnificent boat, came from. Like many of us, or most of us, the impetus, the motivation came from some exterior situation, you know, that people talk about colonialism now. Activists whose ideas I don't really share, they want to rename things and want to bring down monuments, but this climatic change, so to say, includes a process of emancipation, which isn't always very controlled, actually. This change, this climate change has also motivated me to show and, look closer at the subject. And what really surprised me most, I must say, it is so easy historiographically. It's not difficult to find a lot of documents, and I'm glad because this is supplementing other work. Benedict de Savoie, we don't know each other, but my book and her book somehow complement each other. She writes about restitution and about how it takes 50 years for this subject, you know, to find its way into the broad public. Independently, I write about the South Sea, not about restitution, but maybe about how these objects were purchased, you know. And those two books really complement each other, even though we never met, even though we never talked about the subject. It also, you know, illustrates the fact that we share a similar way of thinking. Madame Savoie has been doing this for longer than myself, so not by accident that both of you have been invited to this program.
Thank you very much to you, Mr. Aly. That was our joint evening, and I don't want to forget to give two more hints. One hint about the exhibition Resist in the Rautenstrauch-Joest Museum in Cologne. Now it's open and you can visit it with pre-registration. No, you don't need a pre-registration. So that's really very nice at the Neumarkt in Cologne. And then the book that we talked about, Götz Aly, Das Prachtboot, how Germans robbed the arts treasures of South Sea, in the Fischer Verlag, and you find it in the bookshop of your trust. Thank you very much. In Cologne, it's a wonderful sunny evening. I hope you also can enjoy the sun and the nice evening. Take care and all the best. I also would like to say goodbye. Thank you very much, Mr. Koldehoff, to have taken us through this program, so to speak, so nicely, and to show commitment. And Mr. Snoop, very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and everyone who participated. It's the first ethnological museum that has invited me, and it's really surprising, the invitation went to me before I had published the book, just based on the title you invited me. So that really touched me. And within 5 minutes, I think, I happily accepted the invitation. And I'm so happy that I could be with you tonight. So then we can say, see you again.